You are an insulting, pompous fool.
Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel, and welcome to the channel if this is the first time you're here. This is a bit of a follow-up video, so this is only the second video I've done so far, I think, third one. This is the third one. I did an announcement video for Book Trek this year, and I did a review of the first book I read, which was House of Cards, which was the first one in the New Frontier series, which was highly recommended. I've chosen the books deliberately, or the ones so far that I was going to read, I've chosen deliberately because they were definitely recommended. So I was going in with high expectations. So that was the one that I've already reviewed, House of Cards, book 1 in the New Frontier series, written by Peter David. And the big selling point for me for this was a whole new crew. I thought that was a really interesting thing to start off with, and I thought, yeah, that would be nice. A whole new crew. Clearly not totally new characters. We've got Picard and Spock there, and they are in this book, so it's not just a random cover. And I talked about, in that video, I talked about how it just seemed like not a lot happened, and it was basically introduction to the series, and the whole thing could have been done in about 30 pages. I also wasn't particularly impressed with the writing. So that was the first book I read for Book Trek this year. And my intention was to go on to this one, which is the first one of a trilogy called Star Trek Destiny. And I've got the other two here. And I was going to read some others after that. I've got an Alan Dean Foster Trek log book, which is some of the animation series stories, and I've got a couple of books here which I'll talk about at the end, which are like some of the leftover stuff. But the point is, I found it quite an interesting exercise that I'd already read this. I was going to read this as part of a trilogy, and because this didn't really get going, I had the urge to buy the second one. So I bought the second one. I haven't read it yet, but I bought it thinking that I need to read this, otherwise it feels completely pointless reading that one. So I think that tells you a lot about how much I got out of that one, that I feel like I have to read this one to make the experience worthwhile. So I am going to read the second one at some point, but I've just finished this. So this is Gods of Night. It's written by David Mack. Another one that's highly recommended. This was recommended probably more than the other one, but they're both highly recommended. So regardless of what I thought of that, and I was disappointed with that, I wasn't that impressed with that. It is really, really recommended by lots of people who do videos about Star Trek fiction. Comes up a lot. This one's been recommended as well. I was really impressed with this. I've just finished it, and I am eager to go to the second book, Star Trek Destiny, Book 2, Mere Mortals. I'm definitely tempted to go to that. I can't because of all these different book events and all these things I'm reading. But if I wasn't taking part in specifically Dune on the Range, then I would go to that next, and I'd be very happy to start the second book. So this is a much more complex book. It's much more interesting. It's written really well. So I know Brandy said that she'd read a David Mack book and wasn't that impressed. I was really impressed with the writing. I think it was much more descriptive, much more effort put into the prose. The characters were really well defined, and there was tons of characters in it, and there was lots of plots being interweaved together. So there was actually 4 different subplots in this book, and there were no, you can't say there was no plots in this, but there was one very simple plot that had been wrung out through the whole thing, and even though it's a very small book, that's not about pace. That's about not having any substance. Whereas this is 430 pages or something, and there's lots that David Mack is contending with, because there's 4 different plots that are all linked together, 4 different starships, 4 different crews. Some of the crews are filled with people we know. Three of the crews have familiar characters in them, and there's one ship that is just fully manned with unfamiliar new characters. And on that note, so another comparison, this other ship, it just cracks on with the plot, and there's this ship that you're getting to know as the plot is unfolding, and each time it goes back to that ship, because it obviously interweaves between the four plots, when it goes back to that ship, then you find out more about the crew, and it's quite a diverse crew, and it's probably the most dramatic part of the book is what's happening on that ship. So all that stuff's happening, and this doesn't do what that book does, which is to spend, don't want to spoil it, but it spends the entire book concentrating on the backstory of the captain, and that's it. You know that someone else is going to be in the crew that you're familiar with, but you don't actually meet them, and there's a few other unfamiliar people that are kind of tentatively mentioned, but you get the impression that it's probably going to be developed more in this one. But you know, the whole book is sort of ringing out this character development that's not particularly well developed characters anyway. So it's making a book out of nothing. And this one, 4 complicated plots that are interwoven very well, with quite a big cast of characters, and a ship and a crew that is unfamiliar, that becomes familiar very quickly. So I'll just explain what some of these crews are. So one of them is the Enterprise, that's still captained by Picard, and Picard's second officer in this book is Worf. Definitely a contender for my favourite all-time character in Star Trek. It's like a choice between him and Sisko for me. So I love Worf to death, and Worf's dialogue is well, everybody's dialogue in this, all the familiar characters, their dialogue is absolutely true to how they talk in the series that they're from. So this spans 3 different series. There are 3 different. There's basically Next Generation, DS9, and Voyager characters in this. So each time those characters are in it, their dialogue is really authentic. It's really good, and you can hear the actors' voices behind that dialogue, which is great. I think that's really good. It's not. I don't know if it's absolutely necessary. I still might have enjoyed it if it wasn't, but I think it's a massive plus point. I think you should get that. If you're familiar with the characters, you should hear the actor's voice there, and it should fit, should be authentic. I might have said already in one of the videos that I've only read one Trek fiction book before this year, which was last year's book Trek, which was when I read a DS9 one, and I did think that was done well as well. I thought the characters spoke as they would do, and they acted like they would do, so I think that was good. But it's definitely true for this. And it was quite nice because lots of characters in this. I really like the characters. So Tuvok is in it, and I think Tuvok's brilliant. I love Tuvok. And Ezri Dax has a big part to play in it. And I think it was really interesting because I could specifically hear Ezri Dax's voice, not just Dax. And I thought that's really cool. So whenever she spoke, you got that sense that it was Ezri Dax, with how authentic the dialogue was. So I think that was really good. So anyway, yeah, so Picard is still running Enterprise, and Worf is his second in command. Crusher is still there, Beverly Crusher's still there, and there's a quite an important plot that's done really well, a very emotive plot about pregnancy that does fly in the face of the timeline or the canon or whatever of the Picard series 3 of Picard. So it'd be interesting if I read a lot of Trek fiction. Will I get the impression? You can tell me. Anyone that's read a lot of Trek fiction, is there a sense of the books don't really worry about canon, or is it that this is my first kind of canon clash, and actually they do tend to stay quite close to canon, and they're kind of, they relate to each other, but Picard just changed the rules. If that's true, that'd be interesting. I know that, I mean, Picard season 2, I think it was, definitely contradicted something that happened in Next Generation. So I know that the TV series contradicted the TV series. So I'm not going to suggest that Picard couldn't be blamed for something like that, but I get the impression, because there's hundreds and hundreds of books out there related to Star Trek, I'm wondering if there's not any real consistency with the canon and some of the sort of characters' stories, backstories, I imagine. But again, I'd have to read a lot more to know that for sure. But yeah, it'd be interesting if you could make a comment about that, if you know about that, if you make a comment on the video below, if there is an inconsistency in the books. But anyway, part of the plot on the Enterprise is about Crusher and Picard and a pregnancy, and that's done really well. I think that it's very emotive scenes. It's very good. Again, felt authentic. There's lots of action in here, but there's lots of really interesting plot building. But there's loads of character stuff. So, on the other ship, so on the Titan, just double checking that I'm remembering properly. On the Titan, you've got Commander Riker is now the captain of the Titan, and he's got Tuvok as a senior officer, not the second in command, but he's the senior officer. And Deanna Troi is on there as well, and there's a really important plot that happens with them two as well, and that's really interesting, because that involves Riker's second in command, Christine Vale. She's the second in command, and she's kind of getting in the way of Riker and Deanna Troi in a way that's written really well, and you can see what Vale's thinking, Commander Vale, what she's thinking. And there's a really interesting doctor in it as well, a species I don't remember seeing before, so that's done really well. And it's just lovely to see so much from Tuvok, because Tuvok's in it a fair bit, and it's someone that I've always rated him as a character, and it was nice to see him in this. And then so Dax's all of Dax's crew. So she's the captain of the Aventine, the USS Aventine, and all of her crew are unfamiliar characters. So or certainly characters I didn't recognise. So that's again a full like all new characters except for Dax, who we know really well. But then there's this other ship, which is the Columbia, and the Columbia is the starship that the whole thing is built around. And like I said, that's all new characters, and those characters, because they're fully new characters, you don't know how they're going to react to the situation, and it's a really intense situation they're in, and it's compelling. It's really good. It's really well written. The way the characters do inevitably clash on the Columbia screws up what they're doing massively. They interfere with the stability of a species they've just encountered, and it just spins out of control in a really interesting way. And what happens to the Columbia has consequences for the other three plot lines and the other three ships. So it's really cool. And the way it ends, I mean, the way that ends, like, go back to another comparison, the way that ends, you go, oh, okay, that's all you're giving us. That's interesting. So I guess I might read the next bit of this really slight story. And you're not like going, oh, wow, that's a great cliffhanger. You're like, oh, that's it. This ends, because so much happens in it, it ends in a way that moves it forward and starts combining two of the plot lines. And there's that sense that there's a bit of progress in the plot. And I think, I've said this before on other videos and on the video to the other thing, if you're going to do a long series, each book should stand as a worthwhile experience by itself. And it was my one big criticism of the Blade itself, that I think it does, but only just. Whereas this felt like a really good ending if you're going to go off into the next bit of it, the next development of the plot. So when I read Mere Mortals, the second book, then I think you're going to get more of the consequences of that last thing happening in the first book. And judging on that, if that finishes in that excellent way of developing the plot forward, then this would be the definition of a conclusion, because it clearly is the conclusion, but it will be, 3 separate developments in the story, and to me that makes sense. That's why you would make a trilogy. So I respect that. So I was really impressed with that, and definitely recommend it if you're into Trek fiction or you're curious. I do think that was good. So that was a success. I am going to read that one because I'm curious to know if that's going to justify that a little bit more. There's apparently 11 in the series, but I think there were either 3 or 6 written as one story, and then they carried on expanding on the crew on the ship, I think. Not sure, but I'll read the second one at some point. But this I really want to read, in the sense of it was a good, positive experience and an interesting reading experience, and I was really pulled in, and I think it's well written. So well done for David Mack on those ones, I reckon. Peter David, disappointed. So that's kind of how I was just comparing 2 beginnings of a longer story. And as I said, I've got the Alan Dean Foster thing. It's actually at work, so I can't show it to you, but I've got the Alan Dean Foster Trek log books. And there were 2 others that I had that I was going to read. I'm going to read this one at the same time as Brandy reads it. So How Much for Just the Planet is a book that I think I'm going to enjoy. It looks like a bit of fun, like nowhere near as deep and serious as that one. So I'll be reading that soon. If this is like, this book trek is a summer of book treks, so it's longer event, so I can hopefully read that late July. That's what I'm going to hopefully do. So if Brandy's watching this, that's kind of my plan. So I'm going to read that, and I might end up reading Double as well. So that's another original series one I've got, and then I would have read something from the first 4 iterations of Trek, the original series, Next Generation, DS9, and Voyager. So that's definitely a step up for me on the involvement of book Trek, which I think is really important because I'm co-hosting. So I didn't want to just read one book. But there are loads of different events that I'm juggling at the minute. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to leave Star Trek for a minute. Like I said, I've got an urge to read part 2 of this, but I'm not going to, because I need to get on my horse and start reading some Western stuff, because I ain't got long left on Dune on the Range. I might continue Dune on the Range for longer, maybe a week longer or something, just so I can read 2 or 3 books. So I've got more of a contribution to make. But yeah, certainly from my first journey into book trek this year, I've got those 2 books, very different experiences. One, I was disappointed with the writing as well as what was actually contained in the book, the actual content of the book. And then this one I've just finished, I was really impressed with it, and that's definitely much more of an enticing example of something that makes me want to read more Trek fiction. So there we are. Thanks for watching. Bye.